Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forgotten Generation podcast, hosted by Troy Njenje Mbanga. This podcast is about amplifying young people's voices and the journeys they're on. Today's episode, I am joined by a neurodiversity and social and mobility campaigner, and also an IWA ambassador and youth activist. Millicent, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Millicent. I do a lot of different social action, from campaigning for care experience, strangers, social mobility, and also a bit on the environment. And social action just brings me so much joy. So that's why I love doing it. And I love that it brings me community.
Well, I'm glad, and it's so good to have you on today's episode. And so, what is your youth social action journey?
I started out in a charity shop. I think that's where it really all started. And then I sort of worked my way after I became homeless in my university years. I ended up commuting to university. I had so much time on my commute that I decided I just need to do something valuable with it. And there were so many people experiencing so many of the issues I was experiencing that I felt a sort of moral duty to sort of help support and fix those problems. And once you sort of experience a lot of these problems, kind of almost feel a need to help others. And that's sort of what happened to me. And then I started doing more social action after I joined the Unite Foundation. That's like my first proper job. And then, yeah, it kind of spiraled from there. And I just discovered I loved it. And then it became a bit addictive. So I just love doing it now.
I love that, how your journey's been so many different things, and yes, social action can really be empowering for your voice and also impact so many other young people, which I think is so inspiring and remarkable. And so what made you inspired to have a voice in the first place and be who you are and today in your journey?
That's quite a loaded question. I feel like it's because I didn't have a voice in like many of the environments I was in, whether it was in school or like university, even when I was in um, sort of doctor's visits, like with my autism support and all that, I felt like I never had a voice. All the adults were talking about me and nobody was asking me what I thought or what I wanted. So social action gave me the confidence because I really wouldn't have said boo to goose when I first arrived at university. So I would say it really sort of healed parts of me that I felt that I hadn't managed to find connection in other areas of my life. Because I really struggled with friendship and loneliness at university. So social action really just sort of helped me find my community and helped me find people that understood me. And yeah, now I've got so many lovely social action friends who understand exactly what I'm doing and the need and sort of the motivations behind what we do.
Exactly. And it can bring such a big community social action. And it can also help with loneliness and so many different things that we go through in life. And yes, it's just amazing how you found those social action friends from different groups you're part of, but also the IWA movement as well, because that is a powerful movement that really helps lots of young people with social action. And it can really empower change in so many different areas, which is so incredible. So, what has been your barrier to have a voice and that you faced as a young person and in your community and wider?
I think it was a lot around when people hear you're neurodiverse, they almost sort of start to treat you differently. And often I have been guilty of not telling people I'm neurodiverse because people treat you differently, then they end up sort of like almost dumbing things down to like talk to you. And it's really frustrating because university is a really big scale and everyone experiences it quite differently. And it's a very different experience. But I think it's really quite frustrating because when I tell people I'm like autistic, they expect the sort of autism that they're shown by the media, it's what's portrayed by the movies. But that's like really frustrating because it's only one type of autism that they're showing. People sometimes they don't believe you and they can become quite argumentative. Yeah, so sometimes I have been a bit guilty of not telling people I'm autistic. And I think it's just a stigma of autism at the moment, especially with the portrayals within politics around the social welfare system. And I don't think people understand like a lot around how it works. It's not like something I could just get rid of or cure, which is um, a lot of really weird advice that I get as well. And yeah, it's just strange. It can be quite a minefield finding your voice in that environment when you're still not really kind of comfortable with normal social cues and normal social interactions, which can obviously be quite misinterpreted by people that are neurotypical. So people that we would consider neurotypical think very differently and they have normal social cues that they understand. But for neurodivergent people, we found it really difficult to understand those cues that you might find really quite obvious. So it can be quite a challenge and it can be really taxing in terms of energy. And yeah, that can really make using our voice quite difficult.
Exactly, and that can be like a barrier for so many people with diversity, but also those who have disabilities as well can really feel a lot of like pressure, but also a lot of isolation and feel like they're alone in lots of things because so many other young people don't understand we do things differently, that we might cope with things differently and we might say stuff differently that are completely what's so different to other people. And I think it's so important to acknowledge that we're human about trying to navigate the world in our own different way. And we try our level best to really fit in and to also understand everyone in the world, but it can be hard to express yourself because many people might not understand you. And was that ever something you felt where you felt like you couldn't tell people how, like, who you are because maybe they might judge you for who you are?
Yeah, I think there is, especially in recent years, it's really become quite difficult. And normally, younger people, I find, are quite good about it. And people my age, sort of younger, really quite normalised now. But with older generations, it's still quite stigmatised. And I was trying to explain to somebody the other day that I find really busy situations quite overwhelming. And if I'm trying to focus on doing something, and someone else is then trying to talk to me at the same time, that can be really overwhelming and it causes really challenging for me to process emotions, trying to sort of manage everything that I'm dealing with. So for a lot of people, I try to explain it using the spoon theory, which is really lovely. I love the spoon theory. So basically, it theorizes that you have so many spoons. I sort of say I have 14 spoons. Not very large spoons, but I have spoons. And then I try to explain to people that different tasks cost me a certain number of spoons. So if I wanted to go for a shower, that might cost me 2 spoons. If I wanted to go shopping, that might cost me 5 spoons. And I can only use that number of spoons because that's the energy I have. And if I don't, I'll become burned out or I'll get to a point where I can't manage and then I cause my problems further down the line. So if I used too many spoons, I could end up in a situation where the next few days after that could be really rough. So yeah, I think the spoon theory is definitely the easiest way to explain to somebody because emotions can really add to the number of spoons that you're using up, especially you're having a difficult day. For example, I'm really routine orientated. I have a Notion calendar that is almost military scheduled to the minute. So yeah, I think having that sort of ways of managing your spoons and managing how you cope, whether that is through fidgets or a variety of different things, whether you like to listen to music or whatever. I think it's just helping you to understand that wherever you communicate and whatever you do, that's okay because not everyone's going to experience the world the same as you. And sometimes people may not understand, but if it's working for you and it's helping you manage the world in its overwhelming entirety, then I say go for it. Even if they judge you or stigmatize you, because people are always going to judge you. And I just say that at this point, I just think you've got too much to worry about in the world without letting other people's emotions and judgments bother you. As long as you are happy, that's the priority. If you are doing stuff that helps you manage the world, do it.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. I absolutely love that theory. I think it's good about experience. Something I didn't even know as myself who is neurodiverse. I didn't know about that. But yes, and that's true about music and art and maybe like journaling and maybe have something sensory because and that kind of helps us neurodiverse young people to process like and different things. But if you do want to listen to any more about neurodiversity and about disabilities, we have got a centre series on the Forgotten Generation podcast where you can listen to amazing young people who talk about their lived experiences in their journeys. That's out now, so go give it a listen. And before this one as well. But so yeah, I really think it's so important that about barrier as a neurodiverse young person doesn't affect you but also others, and it's so important to embrace ourselves and embrace who we are. Thank you so much for sharing that. What are the three issues you think young people are facing right now and why? And what do you think and decision makers and the government ministers need to do better in supporting our voice?
For me, I've really noticed that there's two really key things that I noticed over the last year. Because I became unemployed after I left university. So I was only really doing freelance part-time things. And what I really noticed was that there was a big gap where the government weren't supporting disabled people and neurodivergent people through pathways into work if they can work. Because most people do want to work if they're disabled and neurodivergent. It gives us routine, it helps us, it gives us freedom, it gives us access to things, it gives us social life. And most people do. But I don't think the government quite understands that there's still a lot of work to be done by the employers. And even the employers that claim that they're disability accessible and neurodiverse accessible, they actually aren't. For a lot of them, really funny how they can classify themselves. Because a lot of them, for example, have the ability to sort of self-assess, which is really quite bad, really. So they might classify themselves as accessible, but then they've not got a single employee that's got disability or neurodivergence or reasonable adjustment. So if you are trying to get into that workplace, and then, for example, you have a psychometric test, which could be, for example, like a game-based assessment or like one of the sort of things when you go to apply for a job, then those tests are usually based on people with normal neurotypical brains, which is really quite frustrating because then you're expected to have the same scores as them, even though your brain thinks entirely differently and works through a different process. You might have slower processing speeds, and they'll tell you, okay, we'll give you a standardized little bit of extra time, but a lot of the reasonable adjustments that's offered in these tests aren't really helpful for anybody, really, because those original test scores are still based on neurotypical people, which is really quite illogical, really. So there's that, and then there's the physical barriers. There's like things like access with steps, lifts, things that you just don't think about every day unless you actually need them to physically access space. And then asking for adjustments can be a ridiculously stressful process, especially when access to work lists are just so long in terms of waiting times. So it's quite frustrating because those are people that should and deserve to enter work and have amazing experience, don't get the opportunity to. And the government just thinks they're being lazy and it's not their fault. And I think they blame a lot of disabled people, even though when you turn up to these job interviews, people see your disability or neurodivergency you've declared, and then they stigmatise you, they put their perceptions onto you without actually asking what are your needs, what can you do. So they've already made a judgment about you before you can even speak. And I don't think the government understands that. So it's really quite a challenge. But it's quite interesting because obviously there's so many employers that classify themselves as accessible and are quite questionably not. Yeah, I'd say that would be the biggest challenge. Then the other side of it is also the transport. And I would definitely say transport is such a huge issue in this country that's not recognised, especially with passenger assistance. If you've ever been on a train as a disabled person or you're neurodivergent and you've booked passenger assistance, you probably experience they're not turning up, not helping you, just many different things that can go wrong. And I've had friends that have waited over an hour on a train to try and get off because nobody's come, and they physically can't get off that train because they've got a wheelchair, which is just so awful and so indignifying as a human being to watch everyone else get off a train, but you can't simply because the way the system is built. And I think that's just so wrong. And then there's also this barrier where, especially as a young person, driving is so insanely expensive. And if you can't afford to buy the lessons, for example, if you have like an average minimum wage job, once you take like tax and all that out, you're barely struggling to live, let alone pay for driving lessons. And then you'll have the car costs once you get a car. So many young people just can't afford to drive, and a lot of them need cars to get a lot of jobs, even though some of these jobs don't actually need cars or driving licenses. I think it's kind of ridiculous that it's such a massive barrier to young people, especially when we do have public transport. And I think employers should be open to more young people using public transport. I think it's a great way to prove that you do have time organisation skills. And if you can prove that and you regularly travel on public transport, then, you know, it shouldn't be a barrier, because in the current economic climate, who can afford a car, really? So I think that's my other major barrier that I've really noticed. And the cost of travel for young people as well is ridiculous, especially when a rail card is either £24 a year for a disabled card, or then it's like £54 for a 3 year. And that's still quite a large outlay for a lot of young people. So it's an ever increasing barrier when a lot of tickets are like £3 a ticket. So I think we just need to think about how we can make access to transport accessible to enable more people to work, and also like thinking about disability and neurodiversity access. And let's actually ask disabled people what they can do and what their actual needs are, rather than just assuming.
I think, like, and the points that you said are spot on when you said about transport, about driving, and how like how so expensive driving is involved for so many people who want to drive, and also transport with buses, trains. It's so expensive, and it's very much a mess over there. But also employment is the big thing. I think neurodiverse young people, but also young people in general go through all the time, where they get rejected for a job and because of maybe inexperience, and maybe they're a young person, but actually they have those experiences. They want a chance to have a job, and and to be able to have income. And I think employers don't see the value that young people bring to and the workplace. All they see is maybe this young person can't do this because they need this certain qualification. But actually, have you actually looked at the young person's application or their CV? Have you looked at how this young person can bring the big and difference to your organization? And like, have you actually looked at people who need those reasonable and adjustments, who need the extra support in a workplace, those who have disabilities?
It's like such a massive thing when you start to realize if you don't have a disabled person in your workplace or a neurodiverse person in your workplace, and I think that's an indicator of something is seriously wrong. Obviously, there's certain jobs that are not obviously really accessible, some jobs that certain people might find really difficult, but a lot of the thing around it is like thinking about like, is your entry level classification actually entry level? Because I think some of it is like really silly. Entry level is not free, and a lot of employers don't want to train anymore, so they're technically classifying the non-entry level jobs as entry level. And because we don't really want to train a person, but we don't really want to train a young person up to do it. But if you don't train those young people, you don't hire those young people, and you don't have real entry level jobs in your workplace, in your employment, then you're effectively cutting off your pipeline for talent. And if you don't have that pipeline, well, in 5, 10 years, you're not going to have a talent pipeline. So you've just got to think sustainably into the future and think, yeah, it's been nice to have people not to train and spend that at the moment. But in 10 years or 5 years, you might be really regretting that because you're just cutting off your talent pipeline at the source.
And exactly. And I want to see those MPs and those decision makers and government ministers actually talk to those young people. actually talk about what they want in the world, but actually what they want in their life, and not those high up people and assuming what we want. Thanks so much for talking about your like and your three issues that you think people are facing. I think it's very important. And I hope that people listening to the episode can really take away from what you said as well. And so what is one piece of advice to a young person wanting to make a difference but don't know how to?
I think my biggest piece of advice, I must have said this like 3 times this week, is talking to a young person in Slough at an event I spoke at on Saturday. And one of the things that I was kind of sort of sparked out my head was basically thinking about starting where you're at, because when you're a young person, and it is really tempting, given the amount of social media that we consume on our devices, to compare ourselves to others. But I think if we can sort of take a step back from that and just sort of think, okay, well, if I don't compare myself to other people, I mean, the only competition I've got is myself, really. And that is the sort of thing that I sort of really sort of champion, is that recognizing to start where you're at and just sort of say, okay, well, I'm on my own journey and everyone is on a different timeline. Things happen at certain speeds, certain reasons. I mean, I am a bit of a one for thinking that fate just sometimes has a role to play, in that sometimes I look at other people um, that I used to sort of admire, and I used to think, why have they done that in 6 months and I'm still like 14, 16 months behind them? And I've got my own goals, and I sort of think, actually, you know what? If I have my own timeline, it's because I'm meant to be at the speed. As sometimes you need to be at a certain speed to get certain opportunities to come into your life. And just don't go too fast, because everything goes so fast anyway. And if we're just so caught up in sort of how fast someone else is ahead of us or how well they're doing, then we're not going to enjoy the journey and the reward at the end of like coming to that reward and just being in a moment. So I think just starting where you're at and just appreciate that, you know, sometimes things have to happen in a certain order.
And I think it's so true because so many of us love to compare other people's journeys, but in reality, we're all in different journeys ourselves. We're all going to be doing different things, but we all come together as a community, and that's what's something so special is that like that community that we have is strong. Like, even if we have gone to Downing Street and done an event, even if we have done this big an event to make a difference for climate change or something like that, like our voices are still powerful in different areas. Even if your area is to deal with climate change, education, neurodiversity, like we still come together because we still care so much about changing our society for young people and making that difference. I absolutely love what I said about, you know, like starting where you are now and just
Yeah.
I'm a keep going aspect.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think like just recognizing that sort of, I think you forget when you compare yourself to a lot of other people. I mean, a lot of people that are really quite inspirational. And I was speaking to another person about this, one of my friends, and I was like, I actually find really ordinary people quite inspirational, because to have courage to do like amazing things, even if you think you're ordinary, you're probably not, because there's so much going on in the world. If you have the courage to be kind and to do a little bit to help your community or whatever you're passionate about in terms of doing that little bit, I think that's so courageous. And to have that, I think that's inspirational. And you shouldn't discount yourself.
Thank you so much for that advice. It's so inspiring. And so to end this episode, what would be your Forgotten Generation podcast quote and to sum up your journey?
My quote would probably be, even if you think like the people around you have it all figured out in life or whatever they're doing, they probably don't. Because even me, and a lot of people consider me successful, I don't feel successful. I am not built to adult. I feel like I have not even mastered adult life. And yeah, I'd say that would be my quote.
I love that quote. Thank you so much for sharing that. Just thank you for coming on today's episode to talk about your journey and just to really inspire your voice, but also other young people's voices. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Troy.
Thanks for listening to the podcast episode. This is a Be the Change Media Network production. Please support the podcast by subscribing and rating the podcast. I'd love to hear what you like and what could be better for future episodes. If you want to find me, you can find me on Instagram and @Troy, and also on X _Troy. Tune in to next week's episode.